They tell you that the early bird gets the worm, but nobody ever tells you what happens when you catch it and realize it wasn't the prize you were looking for. This is a beautiful foundation for a story about self-discovery. Let's begin this journey with Arthur, diving deep into the heavy silence of a life stuck on snooze. Arthur lived in a world of muted colors and repeating loops. His bedroom was a fortress of drawn curtains, a sanctuary where the sun dared not intrude until it was far too late. Every night, the same cycle played out, a desperate scroll through glowing screens, chasing dopamine in the dark, only to collapse into a restless sleep. When the morning finally breached his defenses, he felt less like a person waking up and more like a ghost inhabiting a body that didn't belong to him. The weight in his chest wasn't physical. It was the crushing gravity of untapped potential and the echoing silence of a life unlived. He watched from his digital window as the rest of the world sprinted toward horizons he couldn't see. Friends from his past were building, failing, and rising again, while Arthur felt anchored in a stagnant pool. The most painful part wasn't the failure. It was the false hope he fed himself every night, the hollow promise that tomorrow would be different. That promise had become a lullaby that kept him trapped in the exact same spot, day after day, year after year. He was perpetually late, not just for appointments, but for his own life. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in the form of George. They hadn't spoken in years, but meeting him now felt like looking into a mirror that reflected a version of himself he had long forgotten existed. George didn't radiate the frantic energy of a man chasing success. He possessed a stillness, a quiet depth that seemed to anchor the very air around him. When Arthur asked the inevitable question, expecting a secret formula or a life-changing windfall, George's response felt impossibly small. "I wake up at 5 a.m., George said, his voice steady. Arthur scoffed, a bitter sound that masked his own disappointment. "That's it? That's your grand secret? Waking up early?" He wanted something explosive, something profound, not a mundane shift in sleep schedule. He felt foolish for even hoping. But George didn't flinch. He leaned in, his eyes holding a gaze that felt like it was searching for the real Arthur behind the weary mask. "No, Arthur, it's not about the alarm clock. It's about meeting yourself. When the world is still asleep, there's nowhere left to hide from your own thoughts." That night, the silence of his room felt different. It was no longer a comfort. It was a challenge. George's words burrowed into his mind, an itch he couldn't scratch. The weight in his heart, which he had always blamed on bad luck or lack of opportunity, suddenly felt like something else. A long-delayed conversation he had been avoiding with his own soul. He stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the alarm settings, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't just set the alarm, he made a pact with the darkness. "Tomorrow," he whispered, though the word felt heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 broken promises. "I will try." As he lay in the dark, he began to realize that the fear he felt wasn't about failing to wake up. It was the terrifying, beautiful possibility that if he did wake up, he might finally have to face exactly who he had become, and worse, who he had failed to be. The suspense of the unknown hung over him, more daunting than any alarm. The alarm clock's chime tore through the silence of the room like a jagged blade at 5 a.m. Arthur's eyelids felt as though they were fused shut with lead, and his entire body groaned under the weight of years of lethargy. The room was a tomb of cool, stagnant air, and the darkness outside his window pressed against the glass, mocking his ambition. His hand instinctively reached for the phone, that familiar, addictive lifeline to the digital void, ready to hit snooze and slip back into the seductive safety of oblivion. But as his thumb hovered over the screen, George's voice echoed in his memory. "There is nowhere left to hide from your own thoughts." Arthur pulled his hand back as if burned. Every muscle in his body protested, crying out for the comfort of the blankets. But he forced himself to sit up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and painful, as if he were breaking through a layer of ice that had encased his spirit for years. His head pounded, and his heart raced with an unfamiliar, sharp adrenaline. He stumbled out of bed, his feet cold against the hardwood floor. He felt untethered, drifting in a world that wasn't supposed to be awake yet. He wandered toward the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peer out. The world was blue, a deep, bruised indigo that hinted at the coming sunrise. The streets were completely empty, devoid of the chaos and noise that usually dictated his reality. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility. Driven by a strange, newfound compulsion, Arthur stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, biting at his lungs and shocking his system into a state of heightened awareness. He walked down the empty sidewalk, his own footsteps sounding startlingly loud against the pavement. He passed a tiny, hole-in-the-wall bakery where the faint scent of yeast and warmth drifted out, and saw a solitary street sweeper working in the dim light, his face etched with a peaceful, rhythmic focus that Arthur found deeply unsettling. He eventually found a wooden bench in a nearby park and sat down, shivering slightly, not from the cold, but from the raw exposure of his own mind. He had no phone, no music to drown out his internal monologue, and no distractions to shield him from the truth. He looked at his hands, trembling slightly, and asked himself the questions he had suppressed for a decade. What am I actually afraid of? Why do I feel like I'm fading away? As the first thin sliver of golden light pierced the horizon, the answers didn't come in words, but in a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, a realization that he was grieving the person he was supposed to become. Tears pricked his eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a man waking up from a long, feverish coma. He hadn't been lazy because he lacked drive. He had been exhausted from the Herculean effort of running away from himself. In the quiet of that morning, the mask he wore for the world finally cracked, and he saw the vulnerability underneath. He realized that the success others chased wasn't what he craved. He craved the ability to look at himself in the mirror without flinching. He stayed on the bench as the world began to wake up around him, the blue light fading into a vibrant, defiant orange. People started appearing, the early joggers, the delivery trucks, but Arthur felt as though he were watching a movie from behind a veil. He was still here, but he was different. The weight in his heart had shifted, transforming from a burden into a compass. He didn't know the full secret behind George's transformation yet, but he knew this: he was no longer a spectator of his own life. When he finally walked back home, the sun was fully up, washing the streets in a harsh, revealing clarity. He didn't return to his phone. Instead, he sat at his table, grabbed a dusty notepad,
and wrote down a single sentence: "I am tired of hiding." He didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, but the suspense of the day ahead felt electric. He was no longer waiting for life to start. He had finally shown up for it.
The weeks that followed were not the cinematic montage of success Arthur had imagined. There were mornings when the cold was too biting, the siren call of his phone too loud, and the crushing weight of his old self fought to pull him back into the deep, dark comfort of his bed. There were days he failed, sliding back into the familiar numbness of scrolling until noon, feeling the familiar, heavy despair creeping back into his chest. Yet something fundamental had shifted. He no longer looked at failure as a permanent residence, but merely as a pothole on a long, winding road. He began to curate his silence. He traded his nightly phone habit for a single page of a book, then a walk in the gray morning light, and finally, the simple, terrifying act of writing his own thoughts. The silence, once a void he feared, slowly morphed into a companion, a mirror that didn't lie. He wasn't becoming a different person. He was being polished, with the grit of his old habits being slowly sanded away by the consistency of his new, quiet mornings. 1 month after that first agonizing alarm, Arthur found himself back on the park bench. The world was waking up in shades of liquid gold and bruised purple, much like the morning he had first met himself. He felt lighter, not because his life had suddenly become perfect. He was still broke, still uncertain of his future, and still battling his own insecurities, but because the fog had lifted. He finally understood why George had been so calm, so infuriatingly peaceful. Arthur pulled out his notebook, intending to capture his thoughts, when he noticed a figure walking toward him through the morning mist. It was George. He looked exactly as he had that first evening, calm, confident, and strangely detached from the frantic pace of the world. But as he drew closer, Arthur saw something else in George's eyes, a flicker of profound, hidden melancholy. George sat down on the bench, not with the triumph of a winner, but with the weary exhaustion of someone who had been holding a heavy secret for a very long time. "You look different, Arthur," George said softly. His voice sounded thin, almost brittle. "I feel like I'm finally breathing," Arthur replied, his heart swelling with a strange pride. "But you don't look like someone who won. You look like you're still running." George let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of a younger version of himself, smiling in front of a house that had long since burned down. "I told you that waking up early helped me meet myself," George whispered, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. "But I never told you what I found when I got there." George turned to Arthur, his expression twisting into something raw and unrecognizable. "I didn't wake up early to find my dreams, Arthur. I woke up early because my past was haunted. Every time I slept, I saw the faces of the people I had let down, the opportunities I had incinerated, and the mistakes I couldn't undo. If I slept late, I had to live with my own nightmares in the silence of my dreams. By waking up at 5 a.m., I simply outran them. I didn't find peace. I found a distraction that looked like virtue." Arthur felt the ground drop out from under him. The inspirational secret he had been clinging to, the life-changing habit, was revealed to be nothing more than a sophisticated form of escapism. George wasn't enlightened. He was just a man who had built a wall of routine to keep the ghosts out. The silence wasn't a sanctuary for George. It was a cage he had built to keep his own demons contained. The twist, Arthur, George added, his voice barely a tremor, is that you can change your habits. You can change your routine, and you can even change your life. But you can't outrun the version of yourself you were trying to leave behind. I thought the morning light would cleanse me. Instead, it just made everything I've done more visible. Arthur looked at his own hands, the hands that had been reaching for a new future. He realized then that he had a choice. He could use his new time to run away like George, or he could use the silence to finally stop running and turn around to face his shadows head on. The morning light didn't bring victory. It brought responsibility. He sat in the quiet, watching the sunrise, finally understanding that the true power of the morning wasn't in the time on the clock, but in the courage to stop running from the world, from his failures, and most importantly, from the truth of who he really was.
Peace isn't found in the hour you wake. It's found in the truth you choose to carry. Arthur learned that the sun rises for everyone, but it only illuminates the path for those brave enough to stop running from their own shadows. Life doesn't change when we keep waiting for the perfect time. It changes when we finally decide to show up. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.